Hey guys, it's me, Mr. Duros here. Just recording this video since I'm not going to be in school today. Thought I'd record this video so we could at least get started our notes and get moving forward on our next unit, even though I'm not there. So just watch and listen, write down your notes as you normally would, and when I'm back on Monday, we're going to continue on with our marathon runner activity. So the next unit that we're going to be covering this year is called homeostasis, and it encompasses lots of different topics, but they all sort of come together as we think about how living organisms maintain the conditions that they need to stay alive and to stay healthy. And so homeostasis is something that we talked about a little bit in seventh grade, and it's an important topic, especially when it comes to the Regents exam. Homeostasis is something you're certainly going to see on the Regents exam, and we're going to do lots of practice here to help us understand what it means and what it is. So homeostasis is considered sort of keeping steady state or keeping balance within an organism. And sometimes we'll see it referred to as dynamic equilibrium. And that this is a word that means not that organisms maintain a steady level, but that there's changes, but they're kept within a narrow range that is makes it conducive for the survival of that organism. For example, body temperature is an example that we come back to all the time when we're talking about homeostasis, that warm-blooded animals like humans, for example, have certain ways of maintaining dynamic equilibrium, maintaining homeostasis in regards to our body temperature. And so we have adaptive behaviors and metabolic activities that help keep our body temperature within a range. Now, if we are sick, if we have a breakdown in some system, then our body temperature may be elevated, our body temperature may drop significantly. And that is a failure to maintain homeostasis. In fact, one of the definitions of a disease is a failure of an organism to maintain homeostasis. And so just because I have it on the screen, it'll be interesting to talk about body temperature. So this graph shows a person's body temperature throughout the day. And as you see, it does vary. It goes up and it goes down. It's not a constant state. But even though it does go up and down, as it's shown in this graph, it's still an example of maintaining homeostasis, maintaining dynamic equilibrium, that these conditions are normal and body temperature is going to go up and down throughout the day. And that's what this graph is showing that, in the work hours when a person's very active, body temperature rises, and while we sleep, our body temperature drops. Interesting research that's come out I just read about it this week, is that actually what we think of as human body temperature, what's normal or average of 98.6, is actually no longer probably the healthy average body temperature for people in the United States. Recently, research shows that 98.6 was arrived at in like the middle of the 19th century, and since then, human average body temperature has dropped over time. And they think that part of that may be due to better health conditions, less inflammation, less stress hormones circulating throughout the blood. And so maybe what we think of as typical body temperature is actually a little bit too high. So we're going to sort of come back to humans over and over again, but we're also going to refer to other organisms, how other organisms maintain homeostasis. And all organisms, whether it's a single-celled prokaryotic bacteria or a complex organism like a mammal, all organisms must maintain homeostasis. And they have certain ways of doing that, certain structures that allow them to maintain proper conditions internally. Obviously, humans and complex organisms have tissues and organs, organ systems that do this, but even unicellular organisms, they have organelles, which allow them to basically fulfill the same sort of functions. For example, this is a diagram of a paramecium here. And so A paramecium is just a single cell, so the parts that you see here within the paramecium, those are organelles, but they have a contractile vacuole, which is shown down here. And that's to maintain homeostasis in terms of their water balance. As water is constantly coming into these protists, they have to pump some of that out. And so the contractile vacuole allows that to happen. The gullet and the food vacuole, these are organelles that are used for taking in nutrients to maintain balance in terms of energy. They have the anal pore, which is a structure used for the removal of waste. So even single-celled organisms can have special structures to allow them to maintain homeostasis. And if we compare animals or more complex organisms with unicellular organisms, what we're going to see is that there's an analogy or there's similarities in how they are able to maintain homeostasis. This is, again, something you're going to see often on the read-ins, is comparing an organelle to an organ and how they fulfill similar functions. For example, obtaining essential compounds, food molecules, nutrients, and then distributing them around the organism. In humans, we have a digestive system for obtaining nutrients and vitamins and food for the energy that we need. In single-celled organisms, in cells, there's a lysosome. A lysosome, as we learned, is an organelle that can help digest larger molecules. So it's analogous to our digestive system. The respiratory system we use to take in oxygen and to remove carbon dioxide waste. Well, in single-celled organisms, they have a cell membrane where oxygen enters the cell and carbon dioxide, other waste, can leave the cell. So they're very similar in that way. A circulatory system in an animal, similar to the cytoplasm or the ER within a single-celled organism to distribute materials around the organism. In terms of removing waste, we have an excretory system for removing that waste. In single-celled organisms, wastes are removed through that cell membrane, through diffusion or through active transport or through facilitated diffusion. We have a respiratory system, again, for taking in material and removing those waste materials, just like the cell membrane. We have a nervous system for responding to stimuli from the outside environment or internally. Unicellular organisms have a cytoskeleton, which allows for the movement of structures within the cell and for the movement of the cell. They have membrane proteins that can receive messages from other cells and sense their environment. Complex organisms have an endocrine system, which helps regulate conditions and regulate growth and other factors within this organism. Single-celled organisms have ribosomes, and they have ways of regulating the activity of genes and enzymes, which allow for the control of internal processes. To fight off pathogens and things like that, we have an immune system. Unicellular life has lysosomes, which contain enzymes that they can use to break down invading cells. So there's a lot of similarities between organs and organ systems and complex organisms and organelles within a cell that fulfill similar functions. So in our unit, what we're going to do is we're going to go through several mechanisms of maintaining homeostasis, and we're going to sort of talk about how a variety of organisms maintain homeostasis. And also we're going to focus on humans quite a bit, talk about certain human diseases, certain body systems within humans to help us understand how this is important. So I've reorganized the body systems a little bit to match up with our marathon runner storyline that we're going to be working on throughout this unit. So you might have to flip around a little bit, but once you find the section we're in, then you'll stay in that section for a little bit. So first, gas exchange. So organisms need specific gases from their environment. Often that's oxygen. They also need to remove certain gaseous wastes from the circulation. And so Organisms do that in a variety of ways. Plants, for example, we've talked a little bit about plants and how they take in gases. We know that there's the stomata, the stoma, which are in the leaves, which allow carbon dioxide in to the spongy mesophyll layer so that carbon dioxide can be available for photosynthesis. There are other ways for gases to enter plants as well. Some plants have lenticels, which are these sort of horizontal lines in the bark of this birch tree. And you see them on lots of woody plants. And this is tissue that's sort of porous that allows gases to be exchanged into the organism. There's also root hairs. And the roots of plants have tiny, tiny little hairs which provide a huge surface area, allowing for gases to diffuse in, especially oxygen. This is one of the reasons why overwatering plants can be harmful to them, because if the roots of plants are sort of sitting in constant water all the time, it means they also are lacking in oxygen. They don't have that gaseous oxygen to absorb in through those root hairs. So it can actually be damaging to overwater plants for that very reason. Bacteria, protists, fungi, they mainly exchange gases through diffusion directly into the cell membrane. We're going to come back to these same organisms sort of each time we talk about a different um, homeostatic method. So Hydra, earthworm, grasshoppers. Hydra is a cnidarian related to things like a jellyfish. You looked at them in 7th grade. Um, in terms of gas exchange, a hydra is a pretty small organism, and it's really only two cells thick. There's an external cell and an internal cell. So they don't really need any complicated respiratory organs or anything like that, because basically every cell is in contact with the water where they can absorb oxygen and release carbon dioxide. So basically every surface is this respiratory surface. Every cell is in contact with the water. Earthworms. Earthworms have a thin, sort of moist skin, similar in some ways to like amphibians, like a frog. And their skin can actually act as a respiratory surface for the exchange of oxygen and the release of carbon dioxide. And so in earthworms, an interesting fact is that they don't actually have red blood cells. Okay. Instead, their blood itself, the liquid portion of the blood, the plasma, it has hemoglobin in it, and that can carry oxygen. That's different than other organisms you might be familiar with. For example, in humans, we have hemoglobin, but it's in our red blood cells, and that's where oxygen is carried. Earthworms don't have that. They don't have those blood cells, but they do have the hemoglobin. And the capillaries of the circulatory system in the earthworm basically in contact with all of the cells. You see that in this diagram below, where you see diffusion in through the skin of the earthworm, and then all of these cells which are sort of in contact with the circulatory system for the exchange of gases. Insects have specialized openings called spiracles. So if we think about the grasshopper, and if you remember back to 7th grade, you looked at preserved grasshoppers. And in the sides of the abdomen, what you saw are these small, sort of look like little holes, and those are called spiracles. They lead into these tubes called tracheal tubes, which eventually end in air sacs. And those air sacs provide the oxygen to the muscle directly. So you can see here, this would be the opening of the spiracle, and air can get in through these trachea all the way directly supplying the muscle itself with the oxygen that it needs. Fish obviously have gills that they use for the exchange of gases, and gills, as you see here in this fish, they're protected by this plate called the operculum. Here's what the gills look if they were outside of the fish's body. You can see they have very fine filaments, very delicate tissue. And so in the water, as water flows over these very fine tissues, oxygen can be absorbed directly from the water into capillaries. And then the fish can circulate that oxygen through the rest of the body from there. And gills must have a constant flow of water over them in order to function properly. When the gills are out of the water, they all sort of collapse on one another, and therefore they're not able to absorb oxygen anymore. And so that's why fish need to be in the water to absorb that oxygen. And then that brings us to humans. So humans have obviously organs for the exchange of gases. The lungs is one of the primary ways that we absorb gases. And so our lungs they're not sort of hollow bags that inflate with air as we inhale and exhale. The structure of our lungs is that they look like, I tend to describe them as sort of broccoli, or these little clusters of grapes. Those little clusters are called alveoli, and they're tiny little air sacs. And as we inhale and inflate our lungs with oxygen, these little alveoli fill up with air from the atmosphere. And as they do that, the oxygen from the air we breathed in can diffuse into the blood of the capillaries that surround those alveoli. At the same time, carbon dioxide waste from the blood in those alveoli can diffuse into the air of our lungs, which we then exhale, releasing that carbon dioxide. And so here's what the lungs look like, the structure of the lungs. You can see all those millions of little branches which each end in one of these little air sacs. If we sort of trace the path that air follows through our respiratory system, we could start up here in the nasal cavity. So the nasal cavity, when you breathe in, we take air in through our nose. We have little hairs, obviously, in our nose, some more than others, that help to filter out little bits of dust and particulate matter from the air. It's why we have mucus in our nose, to help trap some of those particles. And then that air leads back into the pharynx, which is sort of the back of the throat area where our nasal cavity connects with our throat. It's where our tonsils and the adenoids are. Those are lymphatic tissue, which are important in our immune system. Our larynx is also there, our voice box, and the larynx allows us to speak and modulate the tone of our voice and the pitch and so forth. And then the trachea, okay, as you look here, the trachea is also called our windpipe. It's ringed with very strong cartilage to help keep it open. Obviously, if our trachea were to be collapsed or were to be blocked in some way, that prevents air from getting into or out of our lungs, and that can be very dangerous. Our trachea is lined also with cilia, just like our nose is, and mucus as well, to again help filter out the air that's getting into our lungs. And that can be damaged by things like smoking, for example, which sometimes you might hear people talk about a smoker's cough or smoker's voice, because as a person smokes over the years, it damages lots of that tissue in the trachea and the windpipe and the voice box. It's also one of the reasons that you may know people that are smokers have a higher risk of cancers of the throat. And so sometimes if cancer develops in the trachea and the voice box, it needs to be removed. And if you've ever seen a person sort of speaking through a little speaker they hold up to their throat, that's because they probably had surgery on that portion of their throat. There's also a little flap that covers, it's called the epiglottis, and it covers our trachea as we swallow, and that's important. You can see it here. And that's because when we swallow, we don't want food going down into our trachea. If we do, that's called choking. If you ever inhaled, while you're drinking a glass of water or something, you start coughing. Okay, that's a reflex to help expel anything that's in our trachea so that it doesn't get blocked. So you follow our trachea down through our chest, It branches off into two sort of large tubes called the bronchi, and they continue to branch off into what we call bronchioles. They branch and get smaller and smaller, sort of like the branches on a tree, until they end in those air sacs we just talked about, the alveoli. Now, those bronchioles and those tiny little tubes, they are not reinforced with cartilage like the other parts of the um, respiratory system are. As we get to the end of those branches, we get to the alveoli. We have about 300 million making up our lungs. And they're tiny little air sacs. They're only a single cell thick. And like we said earlier, they're surrounded by capillaries. You see that in this diagram here. You see as we breathe in, we inflate these air sacs with air from the outside. And that's when oxygen can diffuse into the blood, carbon dioxide can diffuse out, and then the air can be expelled afterwards. The alveoli themselves can't expand or contract. They don't breathe on their own. Instead, we have a muscle called the diaphragm, sort of tucked in under our rib cage. You can see it there, and you can see it here. And this is a muscle that we have control of. We have voluntary, conscious control of our diaphragm. You know, we can inhale and exhale when we want. We can inhale deeply. We can exhale. It's kind of strange because if you're not thinking about it, you just breathe automatically. But probably right now, because I mentioned it, you're thinking about it and it starts to get weird because you feel like you have to breathe. You have to tell yourself to breathe. Once you forget about that, then your brain sort of takes over and you just breathe automatically. The way our diaphragm works is it contracts, okay? And when it does, it drops down and tightens up, and that lowers the pressure in our chest cavity called our thoracic cavity, and that fills our lungs with air. That's how we inhale. We contract our diaphragm. When we relax our diaphragm, that increases the pressure in our thoracic cavity, and then air is exhaled. So we inhale and exhale by contracting and relaxing that diaphragm. Now, sometimes we might get hit or fall, and our diaphragm gets temporarily stunned. And when that happens, that's what we say when we got the wind knocked out of us. That's a temporary paralysis of our diaphragm. It's scary, but it usually only lasts a few seconds. Or if we hiccup, when you get the hiccups, is a spasm of the diaphragm, which causes the sound that we associate with a hiccup. There's several ways that our respiratory system can malfunction, breakdowns in which we're not able to maintain homeostasis. We're not able to absorb the oxygen that we need or to expel the carbon dioxide that we have to get rid of. Some of these you're probably familiar with, things like bronchitis. Bronchitis is a malfunction, a disease in which our bronchi, those two branches of the trachea as it gets into our chest, become infected or inflamed. Okay, mucus can start to collect there. Bacterial infections can cause damage, can cause mucus to build up and liquid fluid to be stored there, and it leads to difficulty in breathing and constant coughing and pain in the chest. Often, you know, an antibiotic or other medication might be given to help clear up the bacterial infection if that's the problem, and eventually things heal. Asthma is another type of inflammation, and this happens in those bronchioles, those smaller branches of the lungs. And you can see them here that the bronchioles are surrounded by smooth muscle tissue. And when that smooth muscle tissue is relaxed, those bronchioles are nice and wide open, allowing the maximum amount of air to get into those alveoli. When a person has asthma, okay, they have a constriction of those airways, okay, that the passageway into those alveoli is inflamed somewhat and thickened, And so it's more difficult for oxygen to get in, for air to get into those alveoli, and it's more difficult to breathe. Now, if in an asthma attack, okay, during a sudden acute asthma attack, when a person really is having trouble breathing, what happens is those smooth muscle tissues also, besides this typical inflammation, these smooth muscles involuntarily contract, further constricting the flow of oxygen into or out of those alveoli, making it very difficult to breathe. And, asthma comes in varying degrees of severity. Some people have it when they're younger and then sort of outgrow it. Sometimes it can be triggered by exercise or sometimes stress or environmental irritants, things that we breathe in the air. And so there's several ways to treat asthma. Sometimes people take a daily inhaler, um, and that's called a bronchodilator, a medicine which helps to relax that muscle tissue, helps to reduce inflammation in those airways and help allow air to be able to get in more easily. There's also rescue inhalers, which people take only when they have an asthma attack, which sort of act a little more quickly and to open up in case of an asthma attack when a person's seriously having trouble breathing. Yesterday, as you guys were researching a little bit about the novel coronavirus, you read a little bit about pneumonia. Pneumonia is an inflammation of the lung tissue, which allows mucus to start to accumulate in those alveoli. And as fluid builds up in the alveoli, there's less surface area for oxygen to be absorbed. If those alveoli are filled with liquid, it means air can't get in, and it's much more difficult to breathe. Sometimes pneumonia can be caused by bacterial infection or viruses. Other times chemicals. When a person's heart is failing, sometimes fluid in the lungs builds up and the lungs become inflamed. So there's a variety of things that can trigger pneumonia. It's not just one specific type of pathogen or something that's causing the disease. Um, Other types of respiratory malfunctions, emphysema. Emphysema is when the alveoli sort of lose their natural elasticity. Okay, that when a person has emphysema, um, they sort of collapse somewhat and don't maintain their shape, and that decreases the amount of surface area where oxygen can be absorbed. Okay? Often this can be induced by smoking or other environmental contaminants. Emphysema is a disease that people who smoke throughout their life often have difficulty with. Lung cancer, or cancer of the respiratory system, is also a common malfunction in some people. As all types of cancer are, it's uncontrolled cell division. We just learned about what cancer is. And when that um, uncontrolled cell division begins in the lungs, that's what leads to lung cancer. This is one of the most common types of cancer in adults. And it can develop in the mouth, in the pharynx, the larynx, the trachea, the lungs. And again, the risk factors, especially things like chewing tobacco, puts a person at a high risk of mouth cancer or lip cancer, pharynx, because that tobacco um, is having its effect on the inside surfaces of the mouth and the teeth and the gums and the lips, and over time leads to a higher risk of cancer in those areas. Smoking also can lead to a higher risk of cancers of the lungs and of the trachea. There's other contaminants, environmental contaminants as well. Things like asbestos, which you may have heard of, was often used in insulation in buildings and things like that. And they found out later that inhaling this asbestos from the air can lead to increased risk of cancer. And so they had to be taken out of schools and so forth. Radon is another risk factor that you may have heard of. It comes from the ground through um, in certain areas, like before you buy a house, you might have a radon test in the basement to see if there's any radon present. And there's ways of helping to get rid of it. Yeah, lung cancer is the leading type of fatal cancer in adults, and what often happens is that the cancer begins in the lungs, and that's where the initial tumors develop. But in all types of cancer, one risk is in that cancer moving to other parts of the body. Sometimes cancers can move through things like the lymphatic system and spread from the lungs to other parts of the body and start to cause issues in other body systems other than where they originated. Um, all right, so we're gonna stop our notes there today. This diagram, just to finish up, I guess, shows sort of a typical human lung capacity. Sometimes you might go to the doctor if you're having trouble breathing, things like that. They might have you breathe into a special um, tool that sort of measures your lung capacity. And lung capacity can be measured in various ways. Sort of the normal inhalation, exhalation that we take sort of, 20, 30 times a minute. It's called our tidal volume. We obviously you're breathing every 15 or 20 seconds or whatever. Um, you take in some air and exhale some air, but obviously you can inhale much more air than that. If you purposefully take a very, very deep breath, you can inflate your lungs to a much larger degree. That's called your inspiratory reserve volume. And you can also force most of that air out of your lungs with a strong exhalation. And then that's called your expiratory reserve volume. Now, you actually can never really force all of the air out of your lungs. There's always that sort of a residual volume, air that's still left in your lungs. And one of the things that people that have various types of lung issues, the doctors may tell them to sort of work out their lungs by every once in a while taking a breath as deep as you can and exhaling as much as possible. And this is something that can help expand lung capacity or the amount of air that you could take in or expel from your lungs. So that's the end of our notes on gas exchange. And we're going to be talking more about that as we continue to work through the marathon runner activity. And one of the things to think about is there a relationship between what happened to the runner and gas exchange. Obviously, you know that exercise has an effect on our respiratory system, and we'll be exploring that a little bit more next week. So thanks for listening, guys. Have a great weekend, and I will see you all on Monday.